It's really difficult to say if I sit down and do individual, like, oh, this is an individual poetry book. I think what happened is I had poems and I put them together for the first collection, Toes in My Nose. Very, very, very deliberately, with sleeping dragons all around, I knew I wanted linked narrative. I wanted the poem to tell a story, and I wanted it to have a journey. And so the way Sleeping Dragons came to me is that I wanted every dragon to be like a portrait. So to me, those are like portraits of dragons with a narrative built in that tells a story, which is very different from There Were Monkeys in My Kitchen, which begins with a dilemma and situation and then is carried through to its conclusion. And so from my point of view, it's like there's the self-contained poem I'm playing with the words, I'm playing with an image, or it seems like its brevity on the page made sense. I always think it's really interesting that there were so many times that I worked on little poems that were self-contained on a page, because when my children were little and life was busy and I had a million other things to do, it was more containable. Just one thing on a page that I could go back and tinker with and add. It was less overwhelming than thinking I'm working on a book or a project or a novel or a picture book. Even it was like, I'm working on this page, on this poem, and that's what I'm crafting today, and I can work on that, So it was manageable too. But I think the biggest difference is that when you have a story poem or a narrative poem, what you have is a dilemma. Something happens and there's something at stake. And right away, there was a mouse in our house. I guess it came in from the cold. My mother got hysterical and she's 36 years old. Right away, there's a problem, a situation, there's characters, and there's a situation. My mother hated violence. She taught me how not to hit. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, I got to go until this story gets played out, which is different than Zelba Zinnemann ate some cinnamon. It seems like there's no situation there. There's a character, but there's not, what's at stake. What obstacles might get in the way before we get, so there's a yearning, there's a situation to be solved. And I think that's the difference with anything that's narrative. There's a problem and there's a character, and we want to see if that can be resolved, or do we care enough to watch that character go long enough. And so the other ones, I think the other ones are wordplay, and narrative poems involve wordplay, but that's not their reason for being. That's another difference too, is the other ones is a play. And I would say that they're both hard to write and do well in their own ways too. I think that answers the question. And I know, I do think Mary Godet was a very middle ground. That was a very intentional book too. Is like I wanted poems that didn't rhyme. I wanted poems that were shaped differently. Still one of my favorite books, but it didn't do well. And I took the Ferris wheel out of Mary Godet and then developed it into Night Sky Wheel Ride, because I still loved that world of Mary Godet. The art in it, I think, didn't work well for a lot of people in that book. But it was one of my favorite, and it was one of the ones that teachers used and did a lot of stuff with language with. It made me so happy with. But it was one that came in and went out of print, like really pretty. The rest of them all kind of stayed in print, but that didn't. But that was where I was like, you know what? I've gone beyond iambic pentameter, rhyme, and Toes in My Nose, and I want to show like my poetic chops. And I love Mary Godet, but I don't. It's funny how like people are like, oh, I like Toes in My Nose because like they were more understandable. And what I realized in that process of being a writer of children's poetry, even for years, is a lot of people are still afraid of poetry. So if you do simply discombobulating, jumbled up and mumbling, topsy-turvy tumbling, tipsy-tummy tied in knots, somebody's going, no, I want there's a block in the block in the tub, because I can understand that a little bit better. So I thought I took better poetic risks in a book like Mary Godet, and I'd really like to do another book like Mary Godet again, where it's individual poems, but there's a loose connected thread narrative, but the individual poems are really kind of really exploratory, really outside the boundaries. But again, it's what comes next that I've never really sat down going, okay, I want to write a book of collection of poems, or I want to write a book that's a narrative. It's like it comes, and that's the book I pay attention to.